Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Baker apprehends Dylan on a day that begins deceptively ordinary at the BNB shop, the familiar bell chiming over the door and the scent of polished wood and precious fabric hanging in the air. But beneath the lustrous counters and curated displays there's a pressure so thick it feels like the walls themselves are holding their breath, because Will is there, watching, hearkening, formerly uneasy without knowing why, and Dylan is there too, smiling that careful smile he's perfected over times of half-trueness and strategic silences, believing he still has control, believing that whatever murk track him will stay just that, murk, but also Baker way in, steady, undecipherable, a presence that incontinently changes the temperature of the room, and in that moment everything fractures, because Baker doesn't come alone, he comes with purpose, with lines in his hand and a look in his eyes that says the game is over. And when he speaks Dylan's name it's not casual, it's final, it echoes, and Will feels it like a punch to the casket, because nothing prepares you for the sound of authority ending in on someone you allowed you knew, and as Baker calmly but forcefully announces the arrest, listing charges that helical outward like a storm, fraud, conspiracy, inhibition, Will's world tilts, his mind racing to connect blotches he didn't indeed realize was, while Dylan's confident mask cracks in real time, jaw tightening, eye zipping, the bravado draining down as bind come out, metallic and cold, a symbol of consequences long delayed, and the shop, once a place of ambition and contest and rumored deals, becomes a stage for reckoning, with staff firmed in place, guests forgotten, and Will standing there, heart forging, because Baker doesn't just arrest Dylan, he opens a door to trueness that can't be closed again, and as Dylan demurs too loudly, too snappily, Baker cuts through it with data, with substantiation collected patiently over months, substantiation that ties Dylan to opinions that ruined lives, to schemes that manipulated issues at the BNB shop and beyond, to secrets buried so deep indeed Dylan induced himself they'd no way see daylight, but Baker is grim, laying it all out, and every word lands harder than the last, especially when Baker turns to Will and says, nearly gently, that Will deserves to know, because Will wasn't just an bystander in Dylan's route, he was part of the equation, used without realizing it, his trust abused, his fidelity weaponized, and the consummation hits Will like ice water, recollections replaying with new environment, exchanges that formerly sounded inoffensive now glowing red with advising signs, moments where Dylan steered him down from questions, nudged him toward choices that served someone differently, and Will feel sick, betrayed, furious, devastated, all at formerly, as Baker reveals the darkest secret of all that Dylan orchestrated. Events that directly impacted Will's family, his future, his sense of tone, not out of necessity but out of ambition, out of a belief that contributory damage was respectable if it meant winning, and Dylan's silence in that moment is louder than any denial, because for the first time he has nothing left to say, and as Baker leads him down, the sound of steps against the shop bottom feels like a preamble to the end of an period, Dylan falling not just fairly but socially, emotionally, innocently, while Will stands there exposed to the shocking verity that the person he defended, the person he misdoubted himself for, was the mastermind of so important pain, and the shop itself seems changed, stripped of vision, a place where secrets were formerly traded like currency now laid bare, and indeed after Dylan is gone, the impact lingers, because Baker doesn't leave incontinently, he stays long enough to make sure Will understands that none of this was his fault, that manipulation thrives on trust, and that surviving it means reclaiming your narrative, but those words, however kind, do'n't abolish the pang, they do'n't incontinently heal the fracture in Will's casket, because learning the verity isn't clean or simple, it's messy, it rewrites history, it forces you to suffer the interpretation of reality you believed in, and as the shop sluggishly resumes its meter, whispers starting, phones buzzing, the story spreading like campfire, Will remains still, absorbing the magnitude of what's been unleashed, knowing that from this moment on nothing will ever be the same, because Dylan's arrest isn't just a caption or a reproach, it's a turning point, a line drawn between who Will was ahead and who he has to come now, fortified with painful knowledge but also with clarity, because secrets lose their power formerly exposed, and as ruinous as the verity is, it also offers commodity unanticipated the chance to rebuild without falsehoods. To step forward without someone differently pulling the strings, and in that sense, as the doors of the BNB shop close at the end of the day and the lights shroud, the shock gives way to a quiet resoluteness, because while Dylan falls and Baker walks down having done his job, Will remains, changed, yes, but no longer in the dark, eventually suitable to see the full picture, and that changes everything. The fate doesn't arrive all at formerly, it seeps in sluggishly, like water through unseen cracks, and for Will the hours after Dylan's arrest feel fantastic, stretched thin, every sound too sharp, every silence too loud, because formerly Baker leaves and the doors of the B&B shop eventually near, the verity doesn't politely fade into the background, it settles in, heavy and irremovable, demanding to be reckoned with, and Will finds himself alone among mannequins dressed in perfection. Girdled by symbols of a business erected on image and control, realizing how befitting it's that the biggest taradiddle of all was hiding in plain sight, curated and polished just like everything differently Dylan touched. He paces the bottom, replaying Baker's words over and over, each detail slotting into place with cruel perfection, and the more he thinks, the more he understands how deeply Dylan's influence ran, how numerous opinions weren't truly his own, how frequently he second-guessed his instincts because Dylan framed mistrustfulness as fidelity and obedience as cooperation. The disclosure backs, not just because Dylan betrayed him, but because Will now sees how close he came to getting someone he no way wanted to be, a reflection of Dylan's ruthlessness disguised as ambition. The coming morning, the fallout becomes public, and the B&B shop turns into a pressure cooker of enterprise and shock, phones lighting up with dispatches, captions spreading faster than data, and every regard Will receives carrying a question no bone dares ask out loud: how much did you know? It's a familiar atrocity, one Will recognizes incontinently, because reproach no way travels alone, it drags dubitation with it, and despite Baker's assurances, despite the substantiation pointing exactly at Dylan, Will feels exposed, raw, like the verity has stripped down not just Dylan's mask but his own sense of safety. He holds his head high anyway, because shrinking would mean letting Dylan win one last time, and when associates approach him cautiously, offering sympathy wrapped in curiosity, Will responds with honesty, admitting what he didn't know, what he believed, and what he's only now beginning to understand. It's exhausting, but it's also strangely liberating, because for the first time he's not guarding someone additional secrets. Meanwhile, Dylan sits in a stark holding cell, the silence there veritably different from the charged quiet of the shop, and for the first time in times he has nothing to manage, no narrative to control, no followership to charm. The confidence that formerly defined him fractures into commodity, darker, more hopeless, and as hours turn into days, remorse battles resentment in his mind, not for what he did, but for how fully he undervalued Baker and Will. Dylan had always believed Will's fidelity was unbreakable, that indeed if the verity surfaced, Will would vacillate, would misdoubt, would defend him out of participated history, and that misapprehension becomes his topmost failure, eating at him as he realizes that power erected on manipulation is fragile, collapsing the moment light is let in. Back at the B&B shop, Baker's disquisition continues to ripple outward, uncovering connections that force the company to defy its own conspiracy, still unintentional, and exigency meetings are called, strategies reassessed, alliances tested. Will finds himself in strange home, no longer shielded by Dylan's shadow but also no longer constrained by it, and when he's asked to step into a leadership part temporarily, part necessity, part vote of confidence, he hesitates, apprehensive of the irony, apprehensive of the weight of perception, but eventually accepts, understanding that walking down would leave a vacuum Dylan's influence could still poison. The decision marks a quiet turning point, because leadership without deception feels different, slower, heavier, but also cleaner, and Will begins to review what success looks like when it's not fueled by someone additional's ambition. As days pass, fractions of the once resurface with new meaning, especially moments involving people Dylan hurt without vacillation, workers pushed out, challengers crushed, families affected by fiscal ruin, and Will makes a point of reaching out where he can, not to fix what's broken, some damage can't be undone, but to admit it, to hear, to break the pattern of silence that allowed Dylan to thrive. Each discussion chips down at the guilt Will didn't know he was carrying, and while remission doesn't come fluently, responsibility does, and that difference matters further than he ever realized. The trial looms on the horizon, a brewing storm everyone knows is coming, and when Baker visits the shop again to modernize Will on the case, the atmosphere is different this time, lower explosive, more reflective. Baker speaks plainly, outlining how strong the substantiation is, how Dylan's network unraveled briskly than anticipated. Formerly pressure was applied, and how numerous people came forward once they felt safe enough to do so. Will listens, gratefulness mixing with a quiet sadness, because despite everything, there's a part of him that mourns the fellowship he allowed he had, the eventuality he believed Dylan represented, and Baker acknowledges that too, reminding Will that treason frequently hurts most when it comes from someone who formerly felt like family. Public opinion shifts gradationally, moving from shock to judgment to commodity more nuanced, and while Dylan becomes an exemplary tale splashed across media outlets, Will becomes commodity additional entirely, a symbol of survival within a loose system, though he no way asked for that part. He resists the narrative that paints him as an idol, because the verity is messier, filled with missed signs and complicated fidelity, but he also refuses to let Dylan's choices define him, choosing rather to speak openly about manipulation, about how fluently trust can be exploited when ambition goes unbounded. It's uncomfortable, vulnerable, but necessary, and each time he speaks his verity, the grip of the once loosens just a little further. When the day of Dylan's court appearance arrives, Will doesn't plan to attend, believing check doesn't bear propinquity, but commodity pulls him there anyway, a need to witness the end of a chapter that shaped so much of his life. He sits still in the reverse, unseen, as charges are read and substantiation presented, watching Dylan not with wrathfulness, but with clarity, fating the man before him as someone driven by fear of nullity more than power, and that consummation, unexpectedly, brings peace. When Dylan's eyes compactly meet Will's across the room, there's no reason, no plea, just a flicker of recognition that the control he formerly applied is gone ever. The verdict, when it comes, is decisive, and as Dylan is led down, the futurity of it resonates far beyond the courtroom walls. Will way outdoors into the open air, breathing deeply, feeling the weight lift not because justice was served though it was but because the verity, formerly unleashed, ran its course without being silenced or reshaped. He knows mending won't be instant, that trust will take time to rebuild, both in others and in himself, but for the first time in a long while, the unborn feels like commodity he gets to choose. Back at the B&B shop, metamorphosis follows disclosure, subtle at first, also inarguable. As programs change, translucency becomes further than a buzzword, and opinions are scanned through a lens of integrity rather than advantage. Will's leadership evolves alongside the company, shaped by assignments learned the hard way, and though challenges remain, they're faced openly, without rumored deals or hidden dockets. The shop, once a background for secrets and power plays, becomes a place of conservative sanguinity, a memorial that indeed institutions erected on vision can be rebuilt on verity. Late one evening, long after closing, Will stands alone again in the shop, much like the night Dylan was arrested, but the silence feels different now, lower rough, more reflective. He reflects on how near he came to losing himself, on how pain-forced growth he no way sought but desperately demanded, and on how the most shocking secrets didn't just change everything, they revealed what was worth saving. As he turns off the lights and locks the door, Will knows one thing with certainty: Dylan's arrest was the end of a period defined by deception, but for him, it was also the morning of commodity far more honest, and that verity, hard-won and unrecoverable, is the real heritage of everything that came to light. Time doesn't soften the impact of what happened so much as it reshapes it, and for Will the weeks following the verdict unfold with a strange mix of exhaustion and momentum, because while the world seems eager to move on to the next headline, he is still living inside the aftershocks, still waking up some mornings expecting Dylan's voice to be waiting in his messages, some new instruction, some carefully worded reassurance, only to remember, again and again, that the silence is real and permanent. That realization brings relief and grief in equal measure, because even poisonous relationships leave behind echoes, and Will has to learn how to exist without reacting to someone who no longer has power over him. At the B&B shop, changes continue to ripple outward, not as dramatic gestures but as deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable shifts in culture, where questions are encouraged instead of discouraged, where decisions are documented instead of whispered, and where the cost of winning is examined just as closely as the reward. Will finds himself in countless conversations that begin awkwardly and end honestly, and though progress is uneven, there is a collective understanding that pretending nothing happened would be the most dangerous mistake of all. What surprises Will most is how often people come to him privately, sharing their own stories of manipulation, of working under Dylan's influence and feeling trapped between ambition and conscience, and each confession reinforces a truth Will is only beginning to accept. Dylan didn't just deceive individuals, he exploited a system that rewarded silence and speed over reflection and care. This realization doesn't absolve anyone, but it does clarify responsibility, and Will becomes increasingly committed to dismantling the conditions that allowed such control to flourish. He pushes for oversight, for shared authority, for structures that make it harder for one voice to dominate unchecked, and while some resist, uncomfortable with losing the simplicity of top-down power, others embrace the shift, relieved to finally work without fear disguised as motivation. Outside the shop, Will's personal life begins to realign as well. Friendships strained by secrecy now approached with openness, conversations once avoided now unavoidable, and though not everyone understands the depth of what he went through, those who listen without judgment become anchors, reminding him that trust, though fragile, is not extinct. He learns to talk about Dylan without immediately defending or condemning, to describe what happened without minimizing it or letting it consume his identity, and this balance, difficult and imperfect, becomes a form of healing in itself. Therapy helps too, peeling back layers Will didn't know were there, exploring why he was so susceptible to Dylan's approval, how old fears and unspoken insecurities made manipulation easier than he ever wanted to admit, and while these insights are painful, they're also empowering, because understanding vulnerability transforms it from a weakness into a warning system. Meanwhile, Dylan's name continues to surface in unexpected places, not because he is present, but because the consequences of his actions are still unfolding, lawsuits progressing, restitution negotiated, reputations recalibrated, and Will occasionally receives updates he didn't ask for, reminders that endings are rarely clean. He chooses not to follow these developments closely, recognizing that staying emotionally tethered to Dylan's fate would only delay his own growth, but sometimes, late at night, he wonders whether Dylan understands the magnitude of what he lost, not just status or freedom, but the chance to choose differently when it still mattered. That question lingers unanswered, and Will eventually accepts that some answers aren't necessary for closure. The B&B shop itself becomes a symbol of transformation, not because it erases its past, but because it integrates it, acknowledging openly that success built on secrecy is unsustainable. New initiatives focus on ethical sourcing, transparent partnerships, and employee advocacy, and while these changes don't magically erase distrust, they signal intention, and intention, repeated consistently, begins to rebuild credibility. Will's leadership style, shaped by trial and introspection, favors collaboration over command, and though it sometimes feels slower, the results are steadier, grounded in shared accountability rather than fear-driven compliance. There are setbacks, of course, moments when old habits resurface, when shortcuts tempt, but each time, Will remembers how easily compromise becomes corruption when left unchecked. One afternoon, months after the arrest, Baker visits the shop again, not in an official capacity this time, but as someone checking in, and their conversation is quieter, less charged, filled with reflection rather than urgency. Baker admits that cases like Dylan's are the hardest, not because the evidence is weak, but because the damage is so personal, woven into relationships and trust, and Will thanks him, not just for doing his job, but for insisting on the truth even when it would have been easier to look away. That insistence, Will realizes, changed the trajectory of countless lives, his own included, and as Baker leaves, Will feels a rare sense of gratitude for justice that is patient rather than performative. As the first anniversary of Dylan's arrest approaches, Will notices how different he feels returning to the memory, less raw, more reflective, and though the shock has faded, the lesson remains sharp. He marks the day quietly, not with ceremony, but with intention, taking time off, walking through the city, letting himself remember who he was before everything unraveled and who he has become since. He acknowledges the anger that still flares occasionally, the sadness that resurfaces unexpectedly, but he also recognizes resilience he didn't know he possessed, a capacity to adapt without hardening, to lead without dominating, to trust without surrendering judgment. The world keeps moving, as it always does, and new challenges emerge at the B&B shop, unrelated to Dylan but informed by his legacy, supply chain disruptions, market shifts, internal disagreements, and Will faces them with a steadiness born from experience, no longer chasing approval or fearing dissent. He encourages debate, invites critique, and listens more than he speaks, understanding now that leadership is less about control and more about clarity. People notice, not immediately, but gradually, and the shop's reputation evolves, no longer defined by scandal but by recovery, by the visible effort to do better rather than simply appear successful.